with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. We have to get to this. It's not strictly a legal matter, although that does implicate some abrogation of your oath of office. I'm talking, of course, about the Biden White House and the lying that was done about the president's physical as well as cognitive state. Now that we have to endure this idea that, for example, Jake Tapper is some sort of whistleblower.
Oh, please. I know. And his book's coming out, and he cited 200 anonymous Democratic sources. And apparently George Clooney, or Biden didn't recognize George Clooney when he went to that fundraiser. Yeah. And that's why he wrote the op-ed. Don't you know who I am? Or you don't know who I am? And what a biggest insult for Hollywood elites.
Yeah, so Tapper was able to score an interview with CNN. It was a nice get.
And they got his contact.
He offered this little reveal about Biden and what the gatekeepers were concocting to prop him up.
The White House physician, Dr. Kevin O'Connor, was telling White House aides that President Biden's deterioration of his spine, the degeneration, was so significant that if he fell one more time, that he might have to be in a wheelchair and serve in a wheelchair for his second term. But everybody pushed off the notion that he used a wheelchair until after the election. This is all part of a larger whole where the Biden White House tried to hide the extent of his deterioration, both physical and cognitive, as much as possible. In fact, as we all saw, as his shuffling gait got worse and worse from 2003 to 2004, they started putting aides around him as he walked to Marine One, the helicopter. That was to kind of hide from public view how bad his gait was, how bad his walking was, his shuffling, and also in case he stumbled again to make sure somebody was there. And this is just of a piece of an overall campaign to try to conceal from the American people the extent to which the president was really struggling to do his job.
Oh, my God.
And then now, was part of that concealment people like you putting people like Ali Mayorkas on your show and credulously listening to them announce that the president is fine? I was just in a meeting with him. He's probing, he's exacting, he's as sharp as he's ever been, and so on and so forth. Well, he was pressed on that. Pressed on that. He was set up to sort of provide some sort of answer to that obvious question, the sorts of obvious questions they didn't ask when they were covering for Biden and the administration well into the middle of last year. And this is what Tapper came up with.
Alex Thompson and I were on the case, as were lots of other reporters, trying to figure out what was going on behind the scenes. But the bottom line is the White House was lying, not only to the press, not only to the public, but they were lying to members of their own cabinet. They were lying to White House staffers. They were lying to Democratic members of Congress, to donors about how bad things had gotten. And in fact, Alex and I started writing this book after the election of 2024. And we spoke with more than 200 people, most of whom, almost all of whom, were Democrats, and almost all of whom wouldn't be honest with us or wouldn't be candid with us until after the election. And then after the election, we found out all of these things that when you looked at what was going on with President Biden at the time, it probably doesn't surprise you the extent to which he was deteriorating. But now we have anecdotes and facts about what was really going on behind the scenes with details that Democrats wouldn't share with us until after Election Day.
Okay, so this is to say we made a good faith effort, but we were all lied to. And then those 200 Democrats that we talked to, they also made a good faith effort, but they were being lied to. There's some unnamed inner circle that was doing all the lying, but we're not going to name them. And we were all in the dark. So I'm a cabinet secretary, and I'm being lied to. Am I meeting with the president? Do I have questions as to why I can't meet with the president, why you want me to go over to meet the press and say he's exacting, he's probing. I've never been, in a more intellectually rigorous meeting than I was in my last meeting with Joe Biden. I mean, you're saying those things, and now everybody's the victim of a big lie that was perpetrated by an unnamed inner circle cabal. That's what that's what they want you to believe. I do enjoy this, because this is part of the ongoing crack up of this new Marxist party.
And Senator Chuck Schumer, I mean, Casey Hunt from CNN, she was grilling him. He wouldn't answer the question, and other reporters tried.
You said in June of last year, in my meetings with President Biden, I found him to be in command and impressive and wielding influence to make progress on key priorities. But in that same month, Biden apparently did not even recognize George Clooney at a fundraiser. Were you being straight with the American public?
Look, we're just looking forward.
Yeah,
that's what he said. We're just moving forward. Yeah, we're not.
It's time to move on.
Yeah.
Well, he's going to be, and he's being cast as one of the bad guys, and all the press corps, well, the good guys. But the whole point is they're the cabal, and they're just trying. But this is the same sort of cannibalization you see going on at the DNC, the same sort of cannibalization you see going on with Fetterman. They're just trying to protect themselves and their posture, and exile anybody who would present any threat to their power, reputation, political interests. That's what this is. Like, there's somebody, Jake Tapper is like, acting as a whistleblower. I mean, it's so preposterous. Yeah. But go ahead, try and sell it, just like you tried to sell Biden as exacting and probing. Andy McCarthy is former chief assistant U.S. attorney, Southern District of New York, contributing editor at National Review, and author of the bestseller Ball of Collusion: The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Andy, thanks for joining us as always. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So just your view. I mean, I know you're the legal mind, but this is all part of the milieu in which we operate, and you have to have a view on these so-called journalists inside the Beltway.
Well, I used to call it the Democratic Media Alliance, and then at a certain point, I started to call it the Media Democratic Complex. I think I've been using that for over a decade, because I kind of kicked myself over thinking that the media was kind of an arm of the party. I actually thought over time that I had it backwards. That the media is the mothership. It's the progressive hub, and the party is actually an extension of the media. It's not the other way around. So I just find it fascinating to have people who willfully ignored, and not only ignored, but attacked those of us who, had the temerity to notice Biden's decline, which how could you know? Look, I have to say Biden's decline was obvious, but there wasn't a lot there to begin with, Yeah. So I nevertheless, anyone who was paying attention could notice it. But if you mentioned it, they would go after you, hammer and tong. They even went after this special counsel, Robert Hur, who actually, I think, in the end was trying to protect Biden because he decided not, he said he wouldn't prosecute him. He wouldn't file an indictment, even though there was overwhelming evidence of guilt on the preposterous ground that, Biden was a well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory, which, of course, had nothing to do with whether he could have formed criminal intent when he was swiping all the classified documents. But they went after him for noticing. And now what we're supposed to believe is these people who now want you to believe it's not that they were in on it, it's that they were duped. They want you to believe they're reporting now. And I'm like, let's take it from your point of view. If you were actually duped, then why are you competent to report on anything? Because you were denying the things that everybody in America saw with their own eyes.
Right, which Jake Tapper now characterizes as being self-evident. But we just didn't have the substantiation. We're good journalists, Andy, so we had to get the substantiation before we could run with it. And that's where the lying came in, and that's how we were duped.
Yeah, but he didn't need the substantial. You know, when they were saying that Trump was, a clandestine agent of Russia, and all the, the various other things they said about him, for some reason, corroboration was not necessary. For some reason, it wasn't necessary to get like scientific verification or any of that stuff. You know, you could run with it. But with respect to Biden, where the evidence of sense was there for all to see, to the point that people who weren't political people, this was a running joke to them, right? Everybody in America knew. But these guys were the phalanx around Biden who actually attacked people who had the temerity to notice and comment on what was obvious to everyone. And now they want you to believe that they were duped and they're honest brokers who are going to now retail the story for us. You know, it's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. I wanted to get your reaction to sort of the developments, both with Judge Hannah Dugan from Milwaukee County, as well as with Rez Baraka, the mayor of Newark, and possibly other members of Congress that were also on scene in that melee with ICE over the weekend in Newark. We're hearing a lot of now from the left about you don't arrest your political opponents, and we heard this from celebrity J6 committee member Adam Kinzinger in response to yesterday's indictment of Hannah Dugan for felony charges, or for felony obstruction of a federal agency and for misdemeanor concealing a person to help them avoid arrest. This is Katie Couric and Adam Kinzinger pouring over it.
Let's talk about the arrest of that Wisconsin judge, Hannah Dugan, who was arrested by the FBI on suspicion that she had steered an undocumented immigrant through a side door to evade federal agents. Why is that such an outrage in your view?
So it's two things. First off, I didn't know it was illegal to kind of hide somebody that has not been convicted necessarily by the feds. They wanted to deport him. I don't know all the details, but so is this saying that if you know somebody who's illegal and they're at your house and the police come, that it's illegal to say they're not there? That's kind of chilling, to be honest with you, if it's like that. I don't know all the details.
Chilling, Andy.
Yeah, well, the weasel hell is the I don't know all the details. That's what people make outrageous remarks and then they say, but I don't know all the details. In other words, let me say the most outrageous thing I can say, but you can't get on me for being 180 degrees wrong because I don't know all the details, Well, if you don't know all the details, then shut up.
Yep, exactly.
So here's the details. And look, I think that Judge Dugan has a defense here, but I don't think, to the extent that it may not be a winning defense, but I think
what's her defense?
Well, her defense is, let me get to Kinzinger first, and then I'll come back to what the defense is. Well, where Kinzinger is wrong is that the agents, when they showed up, told the judges that they had an administrative warrant for the removal of this character who was in front of her for domestic violence charges, right? So this isn't like somebody like, oh, gee, maybe he's illegal. I don't know. I haven't checked this out. They told him they had a warrant. So this is somebody who they absolutely told the judges, and the judge knows exactly what an administrative warrant is. And the reason they had an administrative warrant is this guy had come into the country illegally about 12 years earlier and been kicked out. So if you re-enter after deportation, you don't have to go through the whole procedural rigmarole. They can find you and get you out of the country because it's not only a prosecutable crime to re-enter after deportation, it makes you automatically excludable. So this is not a situation where it was like there was some mystery about whether this guy was really illegal or not illegal. They had a warrant for him, and the judge knew that.
Well, not only that, she took the affirmative step, as I understand the facts. She took the affirmative step of sending them down to the chief judge's office for a review of their credentials, while she did the exit stage left with the guy that they wanted.
Yeah. Now, but the reason I think that she's going to have a defense, and mind you, this case, if it's a jury trial, it's going to take place in Milwaukee, where they elect the politicians who implement and impose these sanctuary policies. So, it's not the best place in the world for the Trump Justice Department to litigate this. But I think the defense they're going to have is that the agents don't have an arrangement with the state. Not just the state. I guess we're talking about the municipality of Milwaukee.
Yeah.
So like in other places, the agents don't show up and suddenly let the judges know that they're going to try to arrest somebody. They have an arrangement where they go through the court and they go through the court security and all that. In Milwaukee, they have to just show up, which they like to try to do because they know the person's gone through a magnetometer and is probably unarmed. And if he tries to flee, it'll be in a small corridor area and they'll be able to control it. But the court doesn't like this. And the federal agents are using the state instrumentality of a city that follows sanctuary policies to try to effectuate federal law. If this was done in reverse, like if the New York City police were looking for somebody and they realized that the person was going to show up in federal court for a hearing and they decided to go to federal court and arrest the guy, the judges would go crazy. The court security would go crazy. Everybody would go crazy. So the judge is going to say that she doesn't believe her court, which is supposed to not be an instrumentality of law enforcement, it's supposed to be the place where people can come and get justice, that if the reputation of her court becomes that if you show up for your proceedings, you might be arrested by the feds, then people will stop showing up for their proceedings. And that this is a federalism issue. Everybody's talking about this as like Trump versus the judges. It's not Trump versus the judges. It's the feds versus the state. And what is the state required to do in terms of the enforcement of federal immigration law? And that's a more dicey, muddy area than we'd like to think. And I say that, look, I think what she did is reprehensible. But I'm telling you, as a lawyer, she's got to defend.
Well, she broke the law to protect those who are breaking the law. Which makes...
But she'll say that she thinks the feds were breaking the
law. Exactly.
Because the feds were coming and using their courthouse. And look, nobody would argue if the feds had decided to wait outside the courthouse and put the cuffs on him when he came out, nobody would have a complaint. But they used the state's proceedings in order to help them enforce federal law. And that's what she's going to complain about. Hopefully the jury will just say, we hear all that, but, you can't, usher a guy, an illegal alien with a warrant out the back door. But I don't know if that's what they'll do.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? I mean, as Tom Homan had said, you don't have to cooperate with us, but you can't obstruct us. And that's what she did with the affirmative steps that she took.
Right. Well, but she'll say the trespassers here were the feds.
Really? Then have them arrested.
Well, that's the next step, actually, Dan, now that you mention it.
Yeah, well, what about Congresswoman MacGyver?
That's what happens in these things if they get hot.
Yeah, I know you saw the video because I saw you on Fox News with Congresswoman MacGyver who, hip-checked or belly-checked an ICE agent. What should happen to her?
Well, those guys have they don't have an argument. I mean, they're on federal... They're not acting as members of Congress.
Okay.
They're on federal territory using doing things that no one is allowed to do to interfere with the administration of federal immigration law enforcement and the operation of a detention facility. And to the extent that they're trying to paint that as Trump's gulag, that's a facility that Obama used as an ICE processing center, back in 2013, 2014, whenever it was, and the Democrats didn't make a peep about it. So they're clearly there obstructing federal operations, and there's no federalism argument, even though Mayor Baraka is in the middle of all this, because this is not a situation where the feds were commandeering a state facility.
It's federal property.
The Trump administration, it's private property, but it's now been contracted by the federal government. Apparently, there's this Florida company that runs prisons, and they've paid them $1 billion to run that detention facility for the next 15 years. And the whole thing is, our immigration laws are actually pretty good. There's a lot of complaints about the law. The problem is that Congress hasn't provided enough resources to enforce them. So, for example, we have 20 million illegal immigrants in the country. Congress has funded 47,600 detention spaces. And Trump is realizing, obviously, that if he's going to get people deported, if he's going to make that a priority of his administration, as a practical matter, you need prison space to do that, because it simply takes a couple of weeks at least, even with the expedited procedure, to get people out of here, and you have to have a place you can stash them while they're going through the proceeding.
And the federal judge in Pennsylvania who gave the green light to Trump's use of the Alien Enemies Act as the basis of deportations, how does that impact the Supreme Court ultimately adjudicating the matter?
Yeah, I think the Supreme Court's going to ultimately have to decide that. I think that it's a dicey thing for the Trump administration, because they'd like to applaud that judge, but the position that they're taking in the courts is that the courts don't have anything to say about it, that it's the president's call whether there's been an invasion or a predatory incursion. Obviously, the Supreme Court's going to have to be the one to decide that. The judge in Texas, who's a Judge Rodriguez, who's a Trump appointee, he said that Trump wrongly applied the Alien Enemies Act. So now we have judicial decisions on both sides. It's going to go up the chain. I actually think that in the end, Trump would be better off relying on the immigration laws, because he has designated Tren de Aragua and MS-13 as terrorist organizations. There is law to the proposition that the courts won't look behind the State Department designation. So the only issue in any habeas corpus proceeding would be, is the guy a member of the gang? And that's the same in the Alien Enemies Act context. They would have to litigate that as well as whether the Alien Enemies Act applies. And I think it's more complicated. To me, they'd be better off under the ordinary immigration law. I think they're making problems for themselves by trying to go around it.
Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney, Southern District of Manhattan, Southern District of New York, Manhattan, contributing editor at National Review, author of the bestseller Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Andy, thank you as always. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
You too. Always a pleasure. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line. Coming up on Chicago's Morning Answer.
Sir Charles weighs in on men playing women's sports in our latest installment of Sports and Politics at 8:38.
And I've got a story for you, but now let's head into that